So I'll call upon the stage for the next panel, Ed Arnold from the Royal United Services Institute as a moderator, Professor Katarzyna Zysk from the Norwegian Institute of Defense Studies, and General Paloméros, Vice Chairman of the French-American Foundation France, President of the Steering Committee of its Cybersecurity Program, and former SACT. So the title of the panel is Inevitable Adaptations, ?
Thank you very much, and I'll just echo Paul and just say thank you for the invite to Paris on this wonderfully sunny day. And also the introduction to this session on inevitable adaptations. NATO has tried to continually adapt to its environment to maintain its relevance. The last significant adaptation was following the end of the Cold War in 1993, which was a very, very long time ago in terms of defense and security. US Senator Richard G. Lugar stated that NATO should go out of area or go out of business. More than 20-year period of out-of-area operations followed, which have been very challenging for an alliance that is configured to the collective defense of the Euro-Atlantic area. Kosovo in 1999, and Libya in 2011, but most importantly Afghanistan, the first time that Article 5 was invoked, and also the ISAF mission from 2003 to 2014, and then latterly the Resolute Support Mission training from 2014. And just 6 months after the dramatic fall of Kabul, NATO is now faced with new challenges from an old foe, Russia, and not just in terms of what's happening in Ukraine, as Paul said, but also the impact on the wider Euro-Atlantic area. So NATO is now undertaking another significant period of adaptation through its new strategic concept to 2030, which will be unveiled at the end of June at the Madrid summit. And to speak, we have two experts, which have already had an introduction, so we'll move on, and because we don't have a lot of time, and I'll go in the order of the program. So, Katarzyna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well back there? Okay. I have designed my introductory remarks around a few observation arguments regarding the adaptation of NATO, what they have to do in order to maintain relevance and efficacy. And obviously, NATO's strategic concept that will be adopted in June in Madrid, we have to deal with a very broad spectrum of issues, from traditional military threats posed by state actors to challenges in the cyber domain and even climate change. But my introductory remarks are designed around some thoughts regarding the Russia challenge, and now, of course, I will be happy to discuss all the other as you wish later in the discussion part. I think it is still quite early to make conclusive predictions about lessons learned from the conflict in Ukraine. And I think this also applies to the Russian armed forces. There is a lot we know, but there is a lot of uncertainties still. But there are some conclusions we can draw about factors that will shape NATO's process to adapt and remain relevant. And I think the first big question is what kind of Russia will emerge from this conflict, politically, economically, and militarily. A regime change is one possibility, given the vast and growing extent of Putin's miscalculation, although it still is, I think, a distant possibility. An accident and misperception that could lead to escalation and dragging NATO into a direct military confrontation with Russia is also still an option. But thus far, Russia seems to be trying to avoid an escalation into a regional level of war. The conflict will, of course, end with a diplomatic solution, ceasefire. This doesn't seem very likely these days, at this moment, for obvious reasons we can discuss. And of course, a protracted war is another option which will consume Ukraine, but also which will constitute a constant source of instability and insecurity along the NATO's long eastern border. So in all these scenarios, Russia will remain a persistent security problem for NATO in the foreseeable future, perhaps with exception of the regime change in Moscow, possibility, which could potentially alter the trajectory of Russia's relations with NATO and the United States. But even then, it is important to remember or keep in mind that some of Russia's fundamental strategic goals have been long-standing. And this concerns, for instance, the pursuit of the new strategic security architecture in Europe. You may remember former President Medvedev's propositions in 2008, 2009 about signing a new European security treaty, which was largely ignored. Also the objective of reducing the imprint of the United States globally, but in particular in European security, has been a long-standing objective. It was introduced as a cornerstone of Russia's foreign policy concept by Foreign Minister Yevgeny Primakov in 1996. So I think some of these objectives are likely to survive Putin if he goes away. One implication of the Russian pursuit of its strategic objectives in Ukraine and the character of warfare that has been applied is the need, of course, to adapt NATO's collective defense and the current strategy, which is based on the tripwire forces in Eastern NATO members and US reinforcements in case of a conflict, which implies that when attacked, NATO would likely have to initially give up some territories and then take it back once the reinforcements arrive. Given what we have seen in Ukraine and indiscriminate use of force, atrocities, terror, annihilating entire cities, of course, such form of deterrence appears inadequate and insufficient. The strategy also based on reinforcements has its vulnerabilities, as you know, based on some of the capabilities that Russia has developed over the past 14 years. So, of course, this war has exposed some of the structural weaknesses and circumstantial weaknesses in the Russian military organization, but there are still capabilities that could threaten the sea lines of communication in the North Atlantic, which will be, of course, crucial for the US reinforcements to Europe, including long-range precision weapons, attack submarines, or the Russian aerospace forces. So strengthening of NATO will require increasing the ability to defend the territory, which means also deterrence by denial, being able to defend early with short reaction time, with necessary capabilities to deny Russia's military advantage in heavy conventional weapons, long-range fire missiles. And this means also more US troops and European troops deployed to the eastern flanks of NATO. Obviously, this also means a greater responsibility that Europe has to take for deterrence and defense, reducing this heavy reliance on the United States. I think this war has highlighted a number of critical aspects of contemporary warfare. I will not be able to go through all of them. I will just highlight a few. Some of the, I think, critical ones is resilience of societal functions in war, the ability to protect and recover from attacks on these functions. I think also this war has clearly demonstrated the importance of the cognitive domain. So the Western unity and the swift response to Russia's aggressions was achieved partly because Russia has not managed to establish the dominance in the cognitive domain, in the information sphere before and during the attack. And so the Russian concept of information confrontation is more expansive than the Western understanding of information operations or of information warfare, and is understood as an instrument that is cross-cutting the other instruments of warfare. Is understood as, something. This is a foundation of everything else. So, diplomatic, economic, political, military means, and it is to be used during the full conflict continuum. So from peace through crisis to conflict. And I think the Biden administration has drawn lessons learned from what happened in 2014 with that, where Russia was able to stir a lot of confusion. And they have managed to undermine the Russian attempts to forge a pretext and justify the aggression. And this way, the US has denied Russia the dominance of the narrative about this war. So contrary to the situation in 2014, Russia was unable to sow confusion, uncertainty, disagreements about the nature of the conflict, which has severely undermined Russia's ability to weaken and slow down the Western response to Russia's actions. So I think defensive and offensive operations in the cognitive domain should stay high on NATO's agenda. I think Russia also is going to draw lessons learned from what happened. So there are also obviously other key factors that will influence the trajectory of the war, but also shape the NATO's strategic concept. Of course, China and China's responses to the war are of critical importance. One question is whether China is going to continue walking this uneasy balancing act, trying to avoid condemning Russia on the one hand, the Russian invasion, while refraining from helping Moscow to go around, evade sanctions, or providing military assistance. Or perhaps Xi Jinping will choose to support Putin and fan the flames of confrontation with the United States and NATO. In any case, I think the importance of China's responses are obviously not limited to the war, because the strategic challenges we're facing in the Europe North Atlantic region are closely interconnected with the challenges in the Indo-Pacific region. One last remark, so depending on how the military operation in Ukraine will continue to unfold and how fast Russia will be able or unable to recover from the heavy military losses with or without China's help, one possibility is that the development will deepen the Russian perception of its own conventional inferiority, which could lead to further increase of the already central role nuclear weapons play in Russian military strategy and escalatory options, of course. So this can lead to reignite the debate in NATO about the role of the US forces, nuclear forces in Europe, their composition, their numbers, where they are located, in which countries. And there's also this important question of integration between nuclear and conventional planning and exercises, which can, of course, trigger a potential review of NATO's nuclear posture. So I think overall, we have witnessed a generally strong response from many allies, including Germany. Now, the changed security environment includes a significant boost to defense budgets. We see new deployments on the eastern flank. But I think it's been already actually voiced in the previous panels, the question. I think the critical issue is how the commitment, cohesion, and coordination in NATO that we are seeing today, how it can be sustained over time and resist pressure not only from the adversaries, which will be using different tools to undermine that cohesion, but also pressures that will come from within NATO member states as the domestic political winds will be blowing and changing, shifting directions in time ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katarzyna, and thank you also for mentioning the central role of nuclear forces in Russian escalation strategy. The current Secretary General constantly talks of NATO being a nuclear alliance, and there's a lot more emphasis on it at the moment, which shows just how in difficult times we are in. Thank you very much, and I'll pass over straight to the General.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comments. Thank you for the École de Guerre to have organized this symposium, which couldn't be more timely, even if it was organized before what is happening. And this is what we expect from École de Guerre, forward-looking and putting together the big questions of today and even tomorrow. When I read the underlines of this leaflet, it's very interesting. What can stabilize international relationships despite the current uncertainty in the world? I think redefining alliances. I think in the 1949, when the founding fathers, mainly, of NATO get together, and when they tried to put together an alliance that was the main aim at the end of the day. That NATO was not the only piece of the jigsaw puzzle. The UN was a big part of it as well. And so, interesting to reflect what is different now from what was the case and how they came with this wonderful, speaking as a former Allied commander, transformation. Even if I was not born really in NATO, but I really love NATO. What is different and how this alliance, which has been founded in the 20th century after two devastating world wars, is still relevant today. And it's a very interesting question I rarely asked to me. So I take this opportunity to share a few thoughts with you about that. First and foremost, I would say that as a preliminary comment, an alliance for me is not, couldn't be considered as a coalition of circumstances. This is not an alliance. And what we have done in the Gulf War, coalitions, that's different. Couldn't be considered as a group of focus on the special interest. On this point, I'm not sure, let's see, that the Australian, UK, US group is an alliance. I don't know, we'll see in the future. But coming back to NATO as an alliance, what can we draw as some lessons? First and foremost, it was built upon, I would say, very clear, shared, enduring political aim, based on the consensus of the nations who signed the Washington Treaty in 1949, and very respectful of the sovereignty of the countries. And the aim at this time, if I can put that in 3 bullet points, first, to stop Stalin. I was just about to think Putin, but not Putin, Stalin. Okay? Too much media. To stop Stalin, yeah, that was clear. The risk was there. Secondly, to avoid the risk of resurgence of nationalism within Europe. And not only speaking about the former Federal Republic of Germany, but between Greece and Turkey as well, who joined the alliance together. What would have happened without the alliance for those countries? Still to be debated. And third, and perhaps first and foremost, to support and to protect EU and Western European security and prosperity. That was the real aim at the end of the day. So, at the end of the Cold War, a lot of people questioned the relevance of the alliance, saying, well, this is the end of a story, you know that, you have heard that. Nevertheless, and there was a kind of discussions saying, well, are still those aims valid? And it was just that they were still valid, because there were some newcomers knocking at the door of NATO. Those people, those nations, who are so happy today to be part of NATO. The Baltic states, Poland, Romania, many others, and those who are not happy not being part of NATO, unfortunately. But this is history. So it makes sense. This clear, long-term political vision is really what makes an alliance relevant on the long term. So this is not enough to get a global and common political objective. You need a clear and steady commitment. And one best commitment as the famous collective defense, the Article 5. Well, if you read the Article 5 by itself, it's interesting to go into detail to see that it's very committing, but not as much as one could thought. Nevertheless, the commitment is there. The commitment is there that one for all for one, the Musketeer clause, as we call it, and still there. And this is the red line of today, as you know. The borders on the land, the air, sea. Different story with cyberspace, interesting, or exospace, space, nevertheless. So, but that will not be enough to get the political aim, the clear and steady commitment. You need a real relevant strategy. And I'm not speaking about strategic concept. Right? There is a mismatch. Strategic concepts is not a strategy. It's more political guidance from my own experience. But it's fine. We need this political guidance. But afterwards, you have to decline that. And that was part of my job in ACT. As I saw it at this time, there was no really explicit strategy. And so I asked, we, with the staff, we cannot do anything alone, you know, with the nations. And well, what are the key tenets of a NATO strategy? Very easy at the end of the day. Prevent, good. Deter, react swiftly as possible, and we have improved the readiness of NATO in 2014 because of events in Ukraine. We could have done that after Georgia, but we waited until Ukraine. That's another story. And to act decisively. So to show that you are ready. So a relevant strategy is capability without strategy is nothing. With a good strategy. Now, part of this strategy in NATO, and it is quite fundamental, is the nuclear dimension of NATO, which is not so well known. Obviously, it relies on mixed commitment, the US on one part, and US president signing to unleash, I would say, the nuclear bombs, and the countries, NATO countries, who accept to fly those bombs. All right? And the nuclear dimension is part of the collective commitment. It's very important. Not a single country in NATO is a signatory of the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That means that NATO is a nuclear power. In Europe, you have 3 countries which are part of the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That will make, even if there is a wish, that will make difficult for Europe to become a nuclear power one day. Okay. Strategy is fine, political aim, clear commitment, strategy, but without capabilities, it means nothing. So what we need is, obviously, sustainable, credible capabilities. 2014, my command make proposals with others and supported by many countries of raising the bar of spanning for all the allies together. Because cohesion and solidarity is a clear glue for a good and strong alliance. Together to 2% GDP. And in this 2% GDP, 20% devoted to investment. It's very important. And at the end of the day, to my surprise, more or less, it worked. It worked because or thanks to what happened in 2014 in Ukraine. And nowadays, we find even Germany reaching this aim. So we cannot miss with an alliance the opportunity to transform. And that was why the Supreme Allied Command Transformation was born 2003, and that was a long discussion. Should we need NATO? Would NATO need such command, etc., etc.? And at the end of the day, if you look around the world, this is a single entity, which is missing in the EU, for instance. Nobody is looking really deeper in the future. And in NATO, we are fortunate because we invented that. We have not to invent it, it exists. So let's take the best of what is done there for the benefit of all the nations. And when I was there, I was right to waking up the nation saying, we are doing the job here, so let's share. It's very important that you don't reinvent the wheel where we have worked together with your officers and with the resources that we had. But obviously, there could be some gaps and some weaknesses in any single alliance, and it's true in NATO, that should be overcome. The first and foremost, everybody have that on his lips, the over-reliance on US. This is a fact. Not only on US, I would say on France and UK at a different level, but nevertheless. And this is still a very relevant challenge with what is happening now in Ukraine. And you can ask yourself why the Western European countries are not providing more weapons. I have my own explanation, as I tell to media, because most of them, they cannot. To be discussed. There is another question. This is fine to get an alliance, a political with capabilities, but do we trust each other enough to share what is crucial? I mean, intelligence, and tomorrow data, because more and more data, intelligence, artificial intelligence. And third, what do we do as an alliance with emerging technology, which are so crucial for improving our capability and to assess the threat and to face the threats? And we're discussing about hypersonic weapons. I see the ambassador at the France front, he could address that better than me. Quantum, hypersonic weapons, space, cyber. So we cannot rest. NATO has been a wonderful, a very successful alliance because it has been able to adapt and to face the real outstanding topics as much as they can forward. But nowadays, I think as the world is accelerating, it's the time more than ever to ask ourselves, and now I'm speaking as a European, how much European countries now, according to the treaty, the Washington Treaty, which said that the countries must make their duty, must assume their share of the burden, as we say, how much the European will really take their full share of NATO, including in those domains that I quoted. And is not a strong and reliable alliance between NATO on the one hand and the EU on the other hand, which will make, I would say, which will be able to address the main challenge in the world and certainly in Europe as we are facing today and even more tomorrow with the Ukraine conflict. So I pose that as a question and as a belief for me. Only a strong EU with a kind of more strategic autonomy can really bring what it should bring to NATO, and perhaps with Finland and Sweden joining should be even more an incentive, and able to address not only the challenge that we have seen today, but the challenge which are coming, which are there today. Thank you.